My name is Derek Fortini. I'm the director of the Estes Park Museum. Today is November 29th, 2022. We're at the Estes Park Museum, and I'll be interviewing Mike Lewelling.
Can we start off with just having you state your name, birth date, and where you were born?
My name is Mike Lewelling. I'm the Fire Management Officer at Rocky Mountain National Park. I was born in San Luis Obispo, California on September 17th, 1967.
And Mike, what brought you to Estes Park?
To be the Fire Management Officer of Rocky Mountain National Park.
Okay, and do you recall when that was?
September of 2006.
And before you got to Rocky Mountain National Park, were there other parks that you had worked for?
Yeah. So I graduated college to be a PE teacher, and I graduated in December, and I knew I wasn't going to get a teaching job. So I thought, wow, working for a park would be fun for the summer. So I applied to Zion National Park as a fee collector and got that job. And the first week of training was actually wildland fire training. That's when everybody kind of pitched in, way back then, everybody pitched in to do whatever jobs there were. And I fell in love with it. Zion is one of my favorite places on the planet. And I got to do technical search and rescue and fire. And so at the end of that season, I had some friends that were like, hey, you should be a backcountry ranger. And so instead of getting a teaching job, I went to a ranger law enforcement academy and then it was a half fire and half backcountry ranger job. And again, I thought I won the lottery. It was the coolest job ever. I got to do these technical search and rescues through canyons and it just changed my life. So I stayed at Zion for 4.5 years doing fire, and then decided to move to the Grand Canyon, where I worked for a couple years. And after the Grand Canyon, I went to Sequoia Kings, and then I got my first permanent job back at Zion. So I went back to Zion for another 4 years and kind of moved up the ranks there, and then ended up moving to Lassen Volcanic National Park in Northern California. And I went there as the assistant fire management officer, but became the fire management officer position was vacant. So I ended up going right into that position. So I was the fire management officer there for 5 years. And then when the chance to apply to Rocky came open, I jumped at the chance. And was lucky enough to get the job and have been the fire management officer here for 16.5 years.
Great. Do you recall what year you started at Zion then?
1991.
Okay.
March of 91.
And then can you just give me a brief overview of the differences or similarities that the park has in approaching fires versus how Estes Valley Fire District responds to them?
I think we all share the common top goals of whenever there's a fire, the first thing we got to think about is the protection of human life. And then once you're pretty sure, people are out of the way, and we also have to think about the protection of firefighters' lives too, and how we approach, putting a fire out or managing a fire. But once we're pretty sure that people are evacuated, the fire, we have a good plan, protecting the structures and infrastructure, communities, and even natural and cultural resources. There's things that can be negatively affected by fires. So I think we share those. One of the unique things about the park is that, the parks are set aside to allow natural processes to take place, and wildland fire is one of those. So in rare circumstances, and I say rare because Rocky is unique in how it's on the landscape and its relation to Estes Park and all the communities on the east side, we can have objectives on our fires that are resource management based. And why I say it's unique is the east side of the park has a unique weather pattern to where you can't have fire just on the landscape for weeks at a time because we always get really strong winds. And the winds if you follow the wind, it's going to take you to a community. So, we would use those objectives for resource benefits pretty sparingly on the east side of the park. Way back in 2010, we had the Cow Creek fire, and we actually did have resource benefit objectives on that because it had burned itself out to the east, and we had put line in. And then a month later, the fire started smoldering up near the tundra. And so, it had essentially protected itself from going east. So we were able to have those kinds of objectives. But other parks and other areas that have larger landmass like Yellowstone, I've managed fires for resource benefits in bigger parks like that. And it's actually one of the reasons why I got into fire, because of fire ecology, not as much of the adrenaline of fighting fires, but how Mother Nature's role on the landscape and how natural fires burn, I think, is pretty fascinating. So that's one of the differences, is that we can manage for resources.
So with all of your experience in fighting fires, especially at some of these other large parks, how do you think all of that led to helping your experience in fighting the Cameron Peak and these troublesome fires?
I think over the course of my career, and really most people are in wildland fire, it just takes a really long time and a lot of experiences to gain the experience and knowledge on how these kind of fires work, what to expect. Everybody starts at the bottom rung. You're a firefighter digging line, and you're learning from the people that are above you, your squad bosses, and then you become a squad boss. And then you're learning from your crew boss, and then you become a crew boss. And there's these positions and ladders that it just takes time. And like I said earlier, one of the things I really liked over my career was managing natural fires on the landscape. And I've been able to manage these large fires, help at Yosemite, at Sequoia Kings, at Lassen. And one of the things I was going to say about just my career is I was counting, and I've been lucky enough to go to, I think, 48 National Park Service units for my job of doing some kind of a Park Service thing. But back to the experience, I've been able to be the, operations person and the incident commander of these large fires that are on the landscape that are managed a little bit different than if it's just a complete suppression where we have to do whatever we can to put this thing out, because you have to be thinking weeks ahead of time. Where can this fire go? How can it impact negatively or positively the values that are out there? So in the past 5, 6, maybe even 10 years, fires are getting so big that skill set, even if you're trying to throw everything at it to stop it, Mother Nature is doing otherwise. And these fires are getting so big that skill set of looking ahead, trying to plan, where's this fire going to be next, tomorrow, next week, the week after, and like Cameron Peak, months. So I think just those experiences of long-term planning and working as a part of a team and call it shared risk of not one person. Like if I'm the incident commander, I'm not just going to make decisions to just say, all right, we're going to do this. Is that you bring in all the people that share the risk with you of that incident, and bring in all the smart brains to do the best that you can in managing those kinds of incidents.
So let's start with the Cameron Peak fire. Do you recall when the Cameron Peak fire started and when it became a threat to Rocky Mountain National Park?
I could look real quick at the date.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, of course it was all the way down. I had Cameron Peak as a part of this, and then I moved it to the bottom. So, okay, yeah. So So yeah, the Cameron Peak fire started on August 13th of, I think it was 2020.
And then when did it become a threat to Rocky Mountain National Park?
When the fire was reported, we had some people that work at the Alpine Visitor Center report it. And from up there and Medicine Bow Curve on Trail Ridge Road, you could see out and see the column of smoke pretty well, but the distances are hard to gauge. And so the people that were calling it in were saying that it was in the park. And so we mounted a response, and the Fort Collins Interagency Dispatch Center is all of ours, like whether it's Estes Park, the Forest Service, Larimer County, Boulder County, we all utilize that dispatch service to order resources to go to a fire. And so I got a hold of them, and I got a hold of their the Forest Service's duty officer, and that's a person who's kind of assigned for the day to make sure that if you have one fire or if you have 5 fires, you have enough resources and the appropriate resources go to those fires. So I got a hold of the Forest Service, and they started sending engines right away. We both agreed we should launch a helicopter, get eyes on it, try to figure out where it was, and sure enough, it was several miles to the north of the park. So that first day, it made a big run to the northeast, kind of away from, almost paralleling the north part of the park. And then a few days later, we get a random snowstorm, and it just, kind of put it to bed, basically, because it was like 8-10 inches of snow. And in a lot of circumstances, if you got 8 inches of snow, and I forget how big the fire was after that first day, it was probably a couple thousand acres, don't quote me on that, but it was pretty big, but it not completely out of the realm of possibility of trying to get around it because of the snow would help you. But what we've seen with the bark beetles is that the beetles came through 15 plus years ago. They they killed most of the overstory trees. And over the course of the 15 years, lodgepole grows depending on its neighbors for support. And so if the trees are dying, with the support, they don't have to grow really deep roots. So the roots rot really quick. So the trees over the past 15 years have fallen and jackstrawed. And what that's done is it opened up the forest floor to sunlight. So over the past 15 years, now you have sunlight hitting the forest floor, which sprouted new trees, more brush. And so now you've got this jackstrawed big trees all over the place. You have standing trees that fall for no reason. And then you have all the stuff that's on the ground. So if you had a healthy lodgepole stand, it's reasonable to think that, okay, we got 10 inches of snow, let's get some people in dig line and get around it. But with the potential of falling trees, falling on firefighters and killing them, the jackstrawed where you can't use a chainsaw to get through that stuff, plus the new trees, it's just not reasonable or practical to do that.
With that situation, then what was the approach that the park was going to take, knowing that the Cameron Peak fire was that close to the northern border, or even crossing the border at one point in time? With this whole layout that you just gave of what that backcountry looks like, what were your thoughts on how to approach fighting that, or are you just going to let it burn?
One of the things that happens with a large incident like that is the landowner's manager, so in this case the National Forest Service, they'll order an incident management team. And so the incident management team will get a delegation of authority from the landowners, the agency administrators, which allows them to spend money to make decisions on how best to manage the fire. And so what our role with that is it was certainly more of a, the Forest Service creating this delegation of authority and kind of leader's intent, like what do we want this incident management team to do and what are the priorities? And so we were a smaller player at that time. However, the Forest Service brought us in and we had a combined delegation of authority to say, okay, if it goes onto Park Service land, this is what the Park Service wants us to do. And at that time, and at that part of the park, there's very little values at risk. So it's hard for us to say, okay, put all your effort into saving this bridge when you have an entire community that's at risk. So, the incident management team will do whatever they can. You know, if we say that this bridge, this, you know, whatever infrastructure it is important to us, they will do whatever they can to try to protect it, weighing the other responsibilities that they have as well. So, so that was basically how we manage it. Is we manage it through the incident management team, who then implements the protection measures for us.
When did the Cameron Peak fire dissipate, and what caused it to no longer be a threat?
Wow. So let's see, I think I've got some notes. Well, so we know it burned about 7,400 acres in the park. And that was, so the fire made its first big run, it got the snow, and then it was less than 2 weeks later, the snow had melted and we had another wind event. So it took it another, 20, 30,000 acres, I forget. And I think it was on that second major run we had winds out of the northeast, and that's when it pushed it into the park. I don't think the fire was called contained until November, probably about the same time as East Troublesome was. So as far as our concerns were still there because for the park, there was a continuous band of trees that led up to Chapin Pass. And really that was our biggest concern. And the reason being is if the fire continued to move up, go over Chapin Pass, the other side of Chapin Pass is Fall River. And Fall River is in alignment with predominant winds. So the threat of the fire being in Fall River, being hit by a wind event, that would take it straight into Estes Park. So we were making plans, what could we possibly do if the fire keeps coming? And so we worked with the incident management team that, the fire, it ebbs and flows. It, makes a run and then it just falls on its face and it just smolders. And on a lot of those smoldering days, we were able to get a helicopter up and drop water on that leading edge just to cool it down. Usually when you drop water, you want people on the ground to kind of dig it up. But it was such, so far in the backcountry, again, the hazard of falling trees, we just couldn't get people in there. So those water drops did cool it down enough to where it didn't really grow the rest of the summer or in fall towards Chapin Mesa.
And then what was the interaction and communication between Rocky Mountain National Park and the town during that, like the concerns of it coming over Chapin?
The whole time, I was probably speaking with Chief Wolf daily, if not every other day, kind of depending on the activity. But again, it's that shared risk concept that, I'm like, yeah, it's be a really rare event for it to come up and over. But the other thing I've learned is that you can't prepare enough. Over these fires, we started coining the term, hope is not a very good strategy, because we'd find ourselves like, oh man, I hope it doesn't do this. And then it would do it. And so anytime we said, man, I hope it doesn't do that, it's like, well, then we better make a plan so that it doesn't, or so that we're ready. So anytime anybody said the word hope, we would take a step back and go, okay, what's the plan? And so yeah, Chief Wolf was right there. We talked about scenarios. And then further, kind of later in the fall, then we started taking more long-term approach of like, okay, if it did, what could we do? And that was kind of a mixture of looking at old fuels treatments that we've had, But like I said, it really wasn't moving towards that area at that time.
So let's get into the East Troublesome fire. When was it viewed as an initial threat?
I'm going to look at some more dates.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's see. So the East Troublesome fire started on the 14th of October, and it was northeast of Kremling. So that's a long ways away from us. Again, an incident management team was ordered, and they were put in place on the west side in south of Granby. And so they were managing the fire. And for the first couple days, it's like, okay, it's out there. It's good to know about. But then it started moving this way, and the incident management team let the park know. It's like, yeah, you're still 12 miles away, but maybe in 5 days you might want to plan that it could come that way. And so we actually sent a Park Service representative to sit in with their incident management team meetings, and just to be the eyes and ears so that we would know what was going on, and if there were any questions about the park, that person could answer it. And so I think it was the 21st. Yeah, on the 21st of October is when that major wind event hit it. And, early in the morning, we knew it was going to move. And I was in constant contact with our district ranger on the west side. And she would text me, and it's like, hey, Mike, it just crossed, road whatever, and I don't know the road names. And so I'm like, okay, well, that's interesting. And then she says, hey, cross this one, it's a lot closer. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And she said, yeah, the fire's spotted near Sloopy's. And Sloopy's is the burger joint that is right at the entrance to the park. And so at that point, that's when it really dawned on me. I mean, I knew it was really coming fast, but for it to get that fast, I felt bad in that we weren't able to send resources from this side over there fast enough. By the time we kind of made that decision to get people over there, the fire was already, they were in evacuation mode. The district ranger on that side was just on top of it. When we had 5 days, she had implemented, gotten our trail crew and some fire folks together to try to do some last minute fuels mitigation around the housing units, and to prepare. And then she really prepared the staff for what to do if they had to evacuate.
You keep mentioning the fire district manager of the west side. What was her name?
Oh, that's Jerry Pillar. And she's worked for the park for several years.
So it's been said that this is the first ever known leap of a fire over the Continental Divide. Is that true to your understanding?
Maybe in the north, there was a fire several years ago near Wolf Creek Pass, I think, to where it spotted quite a long ways over the tundra, but I'm not really, I don't know the specific details of that one.
Sure.
But it's certainly rare, and it's not something that I would have expected.
Can you describe how this transpired and how you were involved with it, and kind of, really your reaction to hearing that it did come over the divide?
Yeah, so that the 21st, the fire came into the park, and it is worth noting, so when they did have to evacuate, it was starting to get dark, and our district ranger, Jerry, she was like, all right, I'm going to be the last one out of here. And they had to come up and over Trail Ridge Road. And the wind was blowing so hard that there were trees down. As they were leaving, the road was still open. And as they climbed up on Trail Ridge Road, they noticed some lights behind them. And there was a family that somehow was behind them, and a tree actually fell on top of their car. And they were able to make it out. And so when Jerry talked to him, she was like, okay, you were there. Is there anybody else? And they were like, we don't know. And so for that first night, we tied in with Jerry. It was like midnight, and we met at the we met on this side. And, we were like, we can't go back, but we have no idea if, and the people that were there said that trees were falling across the road. So if you don't have a chainsaw, you have nowhere to go. So for that whole day, at night, we had no idea if anybody else was stuck back there. So that was pretty scary. So yeah, we're late into the night. The wind is still screaming, and I thought to myself, it's like, oh man, thank goodness for the Continental Divide, because we knew it was. We actually did send some firefighters that stayed in the north part of Kawanichi Valley and watched as much as they could, and they were saying, yeah, it went into the park so fast and up the it was, I think, the Tanahutu drainage so fast that they were saying it was just ripping. So anyway, when I went to bed, I was thinking, okay, well, we've got a lot of cleanup to do tomorrow and see what happened. We know structures at that point in time. We know structures had burned in the park, and so yeah. So went to bed super late, and then 5:30 in the morning, I get a phone call, and it's the National Weather Service. And I've talked to this guy several times, and he's like, "Hey, Mike, are there any reports of fire on the east side of the divide?" And I'm like, "No. Why do you ask?" And he's like, "Well, we've got a weather satellite that's picking up a heat signature on the east side of the divide." And he's like, "It has to be pretty significant because the satellite's located over the equator, so it's kind of looking north, across the landscape." And at that time, there was so much smoke coming up and over the divide. The wind was blowing so hard that the smoke column never went up. It just went horizontally over the landscape. And so as it goes over the divide, it just hung. And so you couldn't see anything. And then, so the next morning we get up, it's getting light, and we send people out to try to see where the fire is. And it's so obscured that they can't see anything. And then we had some people drive up Trail Ridge Road to close to where Forest Canyon Overlook is. There's a way that you can look downstream right before you get to Forest Canyon Overlook. You can look downstream and look at where Forest Canyon meets. Blanking on the name of the creek, but anyway, and they drove up there 9-10 o'clock in the morning and were able to see smoke, just a little bit, but it was enough that and earlier, once I got that phone call, I called Chief Wolf, called the park, and kind of organized a big meeting. And at that point in time, it's still kind of park. It's kind of a park issue. So we had a meeting in one of our buildings. So Larimer County Sheriff's, a lot of the law enforcement in the area came, the town, and we were all kind of just talking and like, what do we do? And once that word came in that, yeah, the fire's on this side, that's when the decision was made to evacuate town. And that was, it's such a daunting thought to evacuate the entire town that I think everybody in the room, you could just see it in people's faces, but it was what had to happen. And the law enforcement folks from all the different agencies did a phenomenal job. I don't even know how they got everybody out of town in the way that they did, but that was a phenomenal job of evacuating town.
So is that a turning point where once you knew that was going to be taken care of, you could just go back and focus on fire management?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, and at that point, I'm the fire management officer for the park, and so my first thought is, we've got to stop this thing, because in the grand scheme of things, you have these incident management teams. So we have an incident management team in Fort Collins that's managing the Cameron Peak fire. The East Troublesome incident management team's on the other side of the Continental Divide. And so they have limited capacity to even know what's going on the other side of the divide. So over the course of time, it didn't happen right away, but the decision ultimately was for the Cameron Peak Incident Management Team to take over the west side of the East Troublesome Fire. But that morning, it's just a lot of communication and trying to get resources coming and trying to communicate with the incident management teams, and they're completely overwhelmed with all this stuff that's happening too.
I'm curious about this and talking about like what's going on the east side of the park, and talking about evacuating town, and that's the reaction our Estes Park community is having. What was happening at Grand Lake at that time as well? Just trying to think of like how their community is reacting at the same time of how our community is reacting. Just comparing those two.
I actually can't really speak to what Grand Lake proper was doing, but I do know the incident management team. So Grand Lake, and this is a personal feeling of mine just looking at the maps, but if you look at the maps and how the fire came in, Grand Lake was saved by 1 or 2 degrees of wind direction. If you see the perimeter of the fire, if it was out of the west just a little bit more, that would have turned the fire right onto Grand Lake. But what that ended up doing is that it skirted into the park and it left this open edge of fire to the north of Grand Lake. And so the incident management team was able to, I think it was the very next day, they were able to go in and utilize some of our fuels treatments that we've done over time and use that as an anchor to do a burnout on the north side of town. And they were able to let the fire burn into the park because it was already black above it. But they were able to secure it so that, in case there was a wind direction out of the north, that Grand Lake could be kind of secured from the north.
So if you can, maybe just talk about a little more about the progression of the fire once it gets spotted over here on the east side. There already talks about, evacuating town, and that's being taken care of. How did the fire just continue to grow and progress? And where were you guys digging lines and trying to really fight it from?
Yeah, I think trying to answer that question's tough, but so as far as the chronology goes, the fire spotted, and kind of when I think about why the fire didn't go into Estes Park, there's 3 main factors, and the one thing that happened that next day was a fog rolled in from the east. It's a really rare weather event to where the fog rolled in from the east and it was freezing, so it kind of froze to the trees. And I actually have a photo here of a satellite image of how the fog came in, and it stopped at the Continental Divide. So all the fire on the west side of the Continental Divide was still burning as hot and as intense as it did the day before. But the fog came in and just took the punch out of the fire. So that next morning, when we decided to evacuate, there was this crazy, eerie red glow to the sky. And I talked to a lot of people, and they were like, with that red glow in the sky, they told me to evacuate, I was gone, because it was ominous. And so as we were going up into the park trying to figure out where the heck the fire had gotten, the fog had mixed with the smoke, because the smoke from the west side was still coming over really hard and fast and then diving into the fog. So it created a soup that you couldn't see through. And what we found out later is after the fire spotted over, it was on the north side of Mount Wu, up in that where the Fern Lake cabin used to be. The Fern Lake cabin burned in Fern Lake. That whole area, there's like 3,000 acres burned in really intense crown fire. And for that to happen just boggles my mind, because we could, on a sunny day in the summer, we could have a 1 acre fire, and people from the Front Range are going to be calling it in because it's like, oh, there's a fire. But to have 3,000 acres of crown fire happen, and for nobody to even be able to see that it happened is mind-boggling. So, and we didn't know that till much later, but we did send people up and kind of just trying to get an idea where it was. And so we had some folks hike up to Cub Lake, and that's about as far as it came in that drainage. And we were just trying to prepare for that day, because the weather forecast was for 50 to 60 mile an hour winds to return that night. So that was kind of the focus for the rest of that day, was to prepare for the fire to start moving again.
So you have the fog rolling in. You were saying there's a couple of other factors.
Yeah, so there's four factors of why the fire didn't continue, and just clearly the fog was the major factor, but the other is fuels reduction and really phenomenal firefighting. The third one is luck. I've always had this quote is "Chance favors the prepared mind" by Louis Pasteur, and that same concept helped us with the 2012 Fern Lake fire. Is that we weren't able, we do these fuels treatments, and you do a fuels treatment on the landscape, and it's just sitting there. We don't know that it's ever going to help. But by preparing ahead of time, when that chance comes, you can utilize it. And in the Fern Lake fire, and especially in the East Troublesome fire, our fuels treatments that we've been working on for 20 years were instrumental in the excellent firefighting. The firefighters were able to use our fuels treatments in order to plan and then execute how we stopped the fire. I'd like to say it was, someone was asking me, and it just kind of dawned on me. It's like, you know what? We've been fighting this fire for 20 years. 20, 30 years ago, it was recognized that Estes Park and all the communities along the Front Range, even south of the park, are really at super high risk of a fire starting, up in the mountains, and we always get, they're called Chinook winds, 50, 60, 70 mile an hour down-sloping winds. When the wind slopes down, it dries out and heats up. And those are kind of classically extreme fire behavior scenarios. So yeah, more than 20 years ago, the park had implemented a fuels reduction plan. And when I got here 16 years ago, we've been ramping it up ever since and trying to do bigger fuels treatments, more intense fuels treatments. And then, yeah, it went right back to being lucky with the East Troublesome fire.
Mike, I'm curious on a personal level too. What were your thoughts, when you're called in to oversee this fire, and that's what you're called to professionally, but you have a family here locally, and I assume they're being evacuated. How did you balance that, and what was that just like for you personally?
It was tough. Kind of in the moment, it's kind of like game on, and just trying to think of what to do with the fire, what to do with the family, or just knowing that the family's being evacuated. And in this day and age, we have cell phones, and I was able to get some texts out, and I was able to talk to my family. And I did find out that my family drove 2 different cars, so my 16-year-old daughter driving turned the wrong way. So immediately out of Estes Park, they were separated, but they met up at the hotel, so it was all good. But yeah, at that time, it really was game on, because I knew they were safe. But the weight of what I knew was about to happen was just all consuming. And I didn't know how all-consuming it was until 6 months later. So during that time, I'll never forget. So the fog rolls in and the fire's kind of stopped. I was able to run home. I tried to get some sleep and I get a call at 1 a.m. So I go back in and the people we had out are starting to see red glows because the fog is dissipating. The dry, hot wind is now coming up over the divide again. And so trees are starting to torch. And so you can't see the trees because the fog is still kind of there, but you just see these orange glows kind of open and close. And so we were trying to figure out what we were going to do. I had talked to Chief Wolf. He was ordering local community engines from around the area. And so I couldn't stand it. I got in my car and took off up Trail Ridge Road. And it was 3 o'clock in the morning by the time I got up there. And the wind was blowing so hard. I had to park facing into the wind, because if I was facing the other way, it would have ripped the door off the hinges, because it literally was 50, 60, 70 miles an hour. But I got out of my car and I was able to look down at that Forest Canyon overlook. And I've said this, it looked like Mordor. It just looked like boiling lava. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, hadn't had any sleep. The wind is just rocking me all over the place. And the fog is still just kind of there, but I could certainly see these trees torching out. And it was just the most ominous feeling, because we all knew the dry, cold, or the dry, hot wind hitting the fire is going to take off. I mean, there was no doubt in my mind. So I took off down and I ended up meeting up with Chief Wolf at Tiny Town, the country market. And that was kind of a staging area. And he was able to get, I think, 35 engines from around the community and all the communities around here. And that was another thing. I went into the country market and I know a lot of the firefighters. And we all exchanged pleasantries of, hey, how's it going? Isn't this crazy? But you could see it in everybody's eyes. That's the thing I remember, is just, you could just see the stress in people's eyes. And I ended up chatting with Chief Wolf, and we were just like, oh my God, we're going to possibly see homes and businesses burn. And we know these people, we're a part of the community. And that conversation I'll never forget, because it was just so, Chief Wolf and I are pretty close and know each other pretty well professionally, and yeah, just to have that conversation, it's like, okay, game on. It's like, we're gonna do what we can.
When would you say there was a turning point when everybody kind of could start saying, okay, we got this? The town's not going to burn.
Yeah, it was quite some time later. So the incident management team has a division supervisor, and so there was a nighttime division supervisor meeting with the daytime division supervisor, and that person is kind of overseeing the suppression action. And so we met our park superintendent. She came in, and we were all kind of meeting, just trying to transfer as much information as possible. There was a recommendation that we put a dozer line in the national park to the west of our headquarters building. Because again, at this time, everybody fully expected the fire to jump up and start moving like it did the day that it jumped the divide. And so we were like, okay, so let's take stock of what's going on, and we'll kind of make that decision here shortly. So as the sun came up, I was driving into the park, and I kind of looked off to the north, and this was like 8 o'clock. The crews are briefing and trying to get out into the field. And I look over to the north, and the Cameron Peak fire had already started with a plume-dominated fire. I mean, it had already jumped up, and you could see the column off in the distance. And so that was kind of foreshadowing there of what we should expect. So several of us drove up into Marine Park, And I started getting, hearing radio traffic that, someone to the south was looking up on the backside of Mount Wu. And they're like, yeah, the fire's starting to pick up. I would anticipate it to come down the drainage, and we should expect it in the YMCA within a few hours. So it's like, okay. And then so I drove up into Moraine Park with a bunch of people where we have a helispot, and kind of up drainage, you could see a column of smoke coming up. And I do have some pictures of that. Yeah, so this photo was taken several days after the fire. I got up in a helicopter and was able to see that the fire did not burn through the tundra. So there were some little black spots in the tundra, but the tundra did not carry the fire up and over the divide. So the fire, from the last trees that torched, they were at about 11,000 feet. The top of the divide was 12,000 feet. And then where the receptive fuels, where the fire started on this side, was about 10,700 feet.
So this is a couple of days after, but there's snow up there.
Yeah.
Was there snow up there when it?
No.
Okay.
No, we had, let's see, I think it was 2 days after the fog, we had a big snowstorm come in, almost 2 feet, I think it was. And that really put everything to bed. So I told, that chance favors a prepared mind. Several years ago, there was a fire on the East Coast in Great Smokies called the Chimney Tops 2 fire. And I was asked if I would be a member of the review team. So what happened on that fire was, it was a fire that started way into the park, like 5 miles into the park. Initial attack people couldn't get to it, and then a wind hit it, and it blew it into Gatlinburg and Pigeon Forge, and like 1,400 structures burned, 14 people died. It was a big deal. And so when I was a part of that review team, it just dawned on me. It's like, oh my gosh, this is Rocky. It's like this same thing could happen. And so I forget if it was 2016 or 17, I met with Chief Wolf, and we had the first of a few interagency meetings that I called preparing for what we've never seen before, because these fires are happening and it's stuff that we have not seen before. And so we did a modeled scenario with real weather scenarios and everything. And the predicted fire that we modeled, we had 50-mile-an-hour winds, and the fire started just inside the park. And within 24 hours, it had burned all the way through Estes Park. And then by the second day, it had grown north and south. And so this is the modeled perimeter, and this is the downtown of Estes Park. And so when we did that scenario, what it did was it gave us all a common frame of reference of, we talked about it as like, is that real? Do you think that really could happen? And all the professionals in there were like, yeah, that could happen. So that morning when I met with Chief Wolf and, the people that had been at some of those meetings, we all kind of had this frame of reference of, yeah, that could happen. So that picture was kind of in my mind of where the fire could have gone that day. And so 8 a.m. when I was at the helispot, kind of looking to the west, this was the smoke coming out near Cub Lake. And with that smoke that early, again, it was like, oh man, here it comes. And so I waited there for probably an hour or two watching just to see what was going to happen. And kind of up over the horizon, you could see some black smoke, just little isolated black smoke, which means kind of a tree torched out, and then a couple more trees. And what I fully expected to happen was, like, you'll get isolated torching of trees, and what that does is it brings the fire from the ground up into the canopy. And when that happens, if there's strong wind, then the fire's up here, then it moves into the next set of trees and the next set of trees. And so that's called a crown fire. So I fully expected that area, it's the north lateral moraine, I thought for sure it was just going to turn into a crown fire, and it didn't. It just, we started seeing more trees torch, and the fire pretty much stayed on the ground. I think that was because of the fog. So the fog would have, we call them 1 hour fuels because it takes, like pine needles and such, like take an hour to gain moisture from humidity, but then they also take an hour to lose moisture from humidity. And so I think that possibly the trees that were out there were still maybe just a little bit damp and weren't quite ready to have that big crown fire. At the same time, we had like one of our hotshot superintendent, James Champ, he was kind of running crews there, and they had a big meeting about whether we should burn off Moraine Park, or not Moraine Park, Upper Beaver Meadows. And the wind was blowing so hard, because where the fire was, the Upper Beaver Meadow Road would have been a perfect place to kind of just corral it. And so what the plan would have been was to just start burning off the road and then let the fire move towards the main fire. And then once the fire got there, it couldn't go any farther because it's already burned. But the decision at the time was the wind was blowing so hard that they thought that if they put fire on the ground, that they wouldn't be able to stop it from jumping the road. So they're like, no, we can't, we would advance the fire 2 hours if we did that ourselves. So they decided not to start burning. And at that time, the decision to put in the dozer line was made. So putting in a dozer line in a national park is a really big deal. I mean, it's like a last resort. There's dozer lines that are on the landscape centuries longer than the fire effects ever were. So when you put in a dozer line, you're permanently making a mark on the landscape. And so you better have a good reason for doing it. And so this was one of the few times that I think, we would ever put in a dozer line in the park, because the risk was so high. If you drive into the park right now, you'd be hard pressed to find where the dozer line was, because our vegetation crew in the park did a phenomenal job of re-landscaping it and putting in native vegetation. So that was good. But so we put the dozer line in, and then we got a report of fire making a run in Moraine Park. So I drove out there, and there's kind of a funny term in fire, curious non-producer. So I was a curious non-producer. I didn't have a job on the fire, but I had a vested interest in what was happening. And I had the superintendent with me, who definitely has a vested interest in what was happening. So we made sure we had contact with all the people that were there, and especially the division supervisor, because that division supervisor is in charge of the safety of everybody that's in the fire area. So you got to make sure they know. But we drove out with a view of Moraine Park, and sure enough, the fire had spotted into the meadow and was being pushed by the wind. And the same thing happened during the Fern Lake fire. And during the Fern Lake fire, they burned out all the way from Cayley Cottages to the main road, and then to the road that heads out to the campground. For the East Troublesome fire, the line of fire was actually pretty narrow. And so there were a bunch of firefighters in the meadow, and they were able to go direct on the fire, spraying some water, and then also they did some burning out. And so they were able to stop that run. So that was the first run that was stopped. And then we got a call that, earlier in the day, we had a report of fire on the backside of Mount Wu and Steep Mountain, that we should expect the fire to run into the YMCA. And so we had heard, hey, some trees are torching. And so we drove out there to where we got a good look at the backside of Steep Mountain. And again, a crazy weather thing was happening. We had 50, 60 mile an hour winds coming out of the west. But Steep Mountain created this crazy wind eddy. And so the fire spotted, and it was being sucked back to the west because of the wind eddy. So the fire wasn't being pushed to the east anymore. The head of the fire was actually being kind of sucked back. And over the course of the next few hours, firefighters were able to utilize that wind and be able to stop that part of the fire. So while we were there, we got a report of the fire spotting onto, oh shoot, what's the name of it? Beaver Mountain. So we got a report of the fire spotting up onto Beaver Mountain, and it did start a major crown run. So if you're in Moraine Park today, you can kind of look up at Beaver Mountain, and you can see that fire scar of how it ripped up the mountain. And it did finally spot into Upper Beaver Meadows. And so the plan that they had hatched of burning out that meadow, our hotshot superintendent kind of took the lead, and we had some of our hotshots and firefighters, and they started burning off the road. And the hotshot superintendent said that they got around it like with 1 minute to spare. Like the fire was just barreling down on them. And again, I've got pictures of here's Steep Mountain. So the fire was moving to the west. And then this is the Moraine Park burnout, which is pretty amazing. One of the things that happened on the burnout was that there was a culvert that was full of brush and tumbleweeds. And so the fire actually spotted to the other side of the road, not by going over the road, but it went through the culvert. And on the other side of the road is where we had done one of our fuels treatments. So before our fuels treatments, there was lots of dead and down trees, dead trees standing. And so all of those were cleaned out of there. So once the fire got on the other side of the road, it started running in the grass. And they were able to get some engines and hand crews, and they stopped it at about 3 acres. Had we not had that fuels treatment in there, it would have been much harder to catch. And it was going towards the south slope of Deer Mountain. And so had it crossed over and got onto Deer Mountain, it's a clear shot into Estes. So the fire crew got around that part of the fire, and that was when all of the fronts, the main heads coming towards town were stopped. It's still midday, getting into the evening. So we're not, you don't like completely let down at that point in time, but I'll never forget. So everything was stopped, and there's this trail is right at the junction of Trail Ridge Road and Beaver Mountain, or Upper Beaver Meadows. So that's where they stopped it. And so I was sitting right there looking at it. I was in my car, and the operations section chief comes driving up, and he rolls down his window, and he's like, Mike. I'm like, what? And he's like, thank goodness your guys' fuels treatments are there. I don't know where we would be. The actual quote is a little more colorful than that. But he drove off, and I was left by myself. And just something about him saying that our work, our fuels work helped, we stopped the fire, that was when the weight just went. I'll remember that moment forever, because it was just like, oh my gosh. The anticipation of how bad that day could have been was just, it just carries you through the day and everything that you're doing and everything you're thinking. And for that moment to say, all right, the fire stopped, it was pretty good feeling.
I know it takes a lot of individuals and organizations, to take on some catastrophe like this, and you've mentioned a lot of people that were very significant in it. Is there anybody else, just off the top of your head, that you'd like to recognize or specifically commend just for this interview?
I think starting big, the wildland fire community as a whole is a tremendous organization. Just nationwide, it's recognized that no one agency can handle a fire like this by yourself. So the system depends on people working together. And when I first started working at Rocky, this first superintendent here that I worked with was Vaughn Baker, and he said, and I'll never forget, he just said, you know what, make friends before you need them. And I took it to heart. You know, it's just like, you know what, the fire community relies on working together. No matter if you like each other or not, when the bad day comes, you have to rely on each other. And this was a perfect example because there were people from all over the place. And it really worked well. But really locally, you know, Chief Wolf for sure. I mean, he has done such a tremendous job with the Estes Valley Fire Protection District, and the emphasis of wildland fire, I think is well placed. You know, he and I have had many conversations over the years of, you know, and again, this is my personal feeling, is that, you know, the structure fires, yeah, we need to be prepared for those. But when we're looking at the risk to the Front Range communities, it's wildfire. And that's not going away. Mother Nature wants all the vegetation to burn, and it's going to burn sometime. So it just kind of depends on what we do about it. But you know, if I was going to commend folks, you know, certainly our superintendent, Darla Seidels, she is a really good leader as far as, you know, she's not in your face, but you know she's the leader. You know, it's like, okay, I'm not stepping there. You know, she handles it really well. And then you know, and then the leadership of the Forest Service was great. There were a lot of very tense moments during the fire, disagreement, you know, whatever you call it. You know, it was 3-4 months long. But you know, the consistent message from the Forest Service and the Park Service to work together, to work with all these other agencies, I think was phenomenal. You know, I think, you know, clearly my staff, and even our poor seasonals. So the 21st was the last day of work for many of our seasonals. So they got woken up in the middle of the night. We have to evacuate. And then it's like they're no longer employed. So that was really awkward as far as trying to make sure that they were okay, trying to make sure that they had a place to go, you know. But you know, again, our permanent staff, you know, we've had, at that point in time, we had such a stable staff that, you know, it was a pleasure to come to work, pleasure to work with the same people. They're competent, yeah.
So this is, you know, specifically for you and more of a personal, professional question, but with your experience in so many different wildfires now, how high up in memorable fires do you think the East Troublesome and Cameron Peak fires will be for you?
Certainly East Troublesome is up there. Yeah. There's been a few fires over my career. You know, Chimney Tops too, even though I wasn't on the fire, that was memorable as it was just such a lesson learned. There was the Medno fire at Great Sand Dunes, which I think everybody in their career has a moment in time where it's like, I probably could have made a better decision, and you learn from it. That was that fire for me. But as far as overall impact, you know, the impact of that day of knowing in my heart that Estes was going to burn, that was pretty heavy, and I'll never forget that.
So here we are in 2022. What areas of the park are still inaccessible or under active cleanup from the fires?
I don't know if I can accurately answer that. So the burned area response, you know, after fire response, kind of gets moved more to the resource management side of things. So I haven't kept on top of that.
Do you think there's anything they would have done differently with the East Troublesome fire?
That's hard to say. One of the things that, I've done reviews on when bad things happen in fires. And the question that you ask is, why did it make sense at the time you made that decision? And so when I go back to the decisions that I made, it's why did it make sense at the time? And so I don't know that I could say that I would do anything differently, but now I have those images in my memory that when the time comes again, maybe I can make a more educated decision.
Great. What do we as a community, whether it be Rocky Mountain National Park or Estes Park, need to do in the future for fire mitigation?
A lot. Yeah, I think what we've learned in our studies is that we have not been doing enough fuels treatments. So in lodgepole or mixed conifer, those type of vegetation areas, forest stands, we know that they burn in a crown fire. That's just what happens. We have excellent fire history in the park. And we've had huge fires in the 1700s, 1800s, almost the whole west side burned in the 1800s. And so wherever we have those types of fuels, especially on the west or on the east side of the divide, we need to be thinking, what happens if that burns? And if we're not okay with that burning, then maybe we need to do the next best thing, and that's remove the fuel. Now, what that means is removing almost all of the trees, which is not a very popular thing to do, because you cut down trees, it looks ugly for several years. And we have some examples of that in our community. However, that's what we need to be doing. So there is no surrogate for fire in a stand replacing ecosystem. It's either going to burn or you need to mimic that. And what you do to mimic it is remove the trees by chainsaws or machinery. So that is going to be, that's going to be a long process to gain public acceptance of that intensive of treatments, because it's a choice. It's going to burn, and it's going to burn when there's 50-mile-an-hour winds, and there's not much we can do about it. So Estes, the park, like Rocky Mountain National Park, we have 5 major drainages, and all the drainages point to Estes Park. And so it's only a matter of time that one of those fires meets up with a drainage that meets up with wind channeling, and Estes Park is right there. Other things that you can do is hardening your home. So there's fuels treatments, there's FireWise standards, and even going a little farther with FireWise standards is hardening your home. So, you could theoretically clear cut 100 feet away from your home, and yet your house could still burn down because of embers being thrown a half a mile away and land on, some pine needles or on a wooden deck. And Estes Park has a lot of older homes, so we have a lot of open exposed wood on our homes. So just trying to find those places where, okay, if an ember shower comes, where is it going to light? And then try to mitigate that in your home. And then certainly the FireWise of trying to get the trees away from your home, and then the more intensive fuels treatments, maybe an HOA scale, and then the larger land management agencies are doing that too. So,
how did COVID-19 impact the fire operations, or was it significant? I mean, I know it was in community and picking up in the world and everything, but no, not really. Yeah.
There were some significant things that happened. There was one firefighter that was in the hospital, this close to death for 2 months during Cameron Peak. But and and there were plans that were made, some crews had to be sent home, so it affected it, but not significantly in the overall picture.
Are there any other stories that we didn't capture that you'd like to share?
I think I told all my stories.
You did a great job. I don't know if we want to go through any other slides. Helpful, so.
That's the west side. So this picture is pretty awesome.
Wow.
Just kind of shows you the power of.
That's taken out of a plane?
Yeah, just somebody. This is one I just got off the internet.
That's impressive.
And again, yeah, looking over Granby. So this slide, this was so the day before the fire took off. It just shows the path and how far it actually had to go to get to the other side. And that was like 21 miles in one day. And again, the town of Grand Lake, 1 degree. If the wind was coming out, just 1 degree different.
And moving that far is not unheard of, but it's not common, right?
Not common. It's rare that a fire will move that far in a day. So it was definitely a unique phenomenon. So this is County Road 125 on the west side. So it had just spotted over and kept running. And then this one just, there's so many people that say, oh yeah, thank goodness we got that snow. And it's like, no, it wasn't the snow, it was the fog. I got another picture that shows it, but, oh yeah. So that's when the evacuations, the eerie red glow, the spot fire. So that was the west side, just kind of moving up the Kawanichi Valley. This was the morning of the fog. That's why we couldn't see anything. This is the, what's it called? That little visitor center in Moraine Park. Kind of overlooks Moraine Park.
Oh, like the Discovery?
Discovery Center, yeah.
Okay.
Yep. And then this is after I drove up, 3 o'clock in the morning. It was just eerie.
And you're up there all by yourself?
All by myself, yeah, which was eerie in itself.
Yeah.
And then this is when I talked to Chief Wolf. And then this is the scenario for that, planning for what we've never seen before.
Now, I was curious too with the scenario, because you're saying how quick it burned. Would that have been like without anybody actually actively fighting it, just to see how it would go through, or is that factoring in?
It could be both.
Okay.
Like it could move so fast that we would throw everything at it and it would still look like that.
Okay.
That's, again, that's another thing that an expectation of the public is that, well, we'll just get more firefighters and we need more air tankers. And that's a pet peeve of mine because, an air tanker's millions of dollars. And, I don't know if you ever tried to put out a fire, you have a fire and you get 10 gallons of water and you dump it on the top and it goes, psh, and then the water evaporates and the fire keeps going. So you have to have people dig and you have to have people on the ground to support the aerial resources. So air tankers, especially in the Front Range, are not the answer. Certainly they're a supplement and there's places that they work, but you got to have people on the ground. Then the other thing that kind of drives me crazy is that we don't see too many hurricane fighters or tornado fighters, or now in Hawaii you don't see a lot of volcano fighters. So all of those natural phenomenon, we just take it for granted that Mother Nature is going to do what she's going to do. But firefighters, it's a natural phenomenon that we have this unrealistic expectation that we can do something about it. And certainly when the fires are small, yeah, we can put them out. But that just makes Mother Nature mad because she's like, hey, I meant for that to burn. So over the course of the next 10 years, I'm going to grow some more trees. That tree's going to die and fall on the ground. And then the needles are going to fall. And then over the next 30 years, more trees. So she tries to make it more flammable. And then another fire starts and we put it out. And then she gets really mad. It's like, okay, the next fire, I'm going to wait. I'm going to start that fire and I'm going to wait for this wind to come, and you're not going to be able to do anything about it. So it is kind of, we are good at putting out small fires, but it's when they want to do that, it doesn't matter what we want to do.
That is a very, very interesting point.
So this is just kind of progress through the day. This is when I was looking towards the Cameron Peak fire at 8 a.m. Big old column of smoke coming up.
And where is that at?
This is the entrance station, Beaver Meadows entrance station, looking back.
Okay.
And then this is the meeting trying to decide whether we're going to burn this out or not, and they decided not to. So then there's the dozer line. And then I think, yeah, this is Moraine Park. And then this is Beaver Mountain torching off. And then that's Steep Mountain. This is the burnout. So he's got a drip torch in his hand, so he's lighting all this stuff on fire.
Wow.
And then this is afterwards. The spot fire, the road goes right through here, and that's the spot fire that they caught. And then the trail that they held it on. And then for the west side of the park, these are the fuels mitigation that we did. And then here's Grand Lake, and then you can see above Grand Lake, we've got this fuels treatment that goes across.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what they used to burn off of to help protect the town. This is kind of hard to see, but you can kind of see this line of cleared trees from the satellite picture. And then this is an interesting theory that I've kind of talked to some professor, a professor at CSU, but I was like, what do you think about, it's like, why didn't our housing area on the west side burn? And I was like, I think it's because of the bark beetles. Because over the past 15 years, the bark beetles came through, killed a bunch of trees, and we removed them, because this is in a developed area, we removed all the dead trees. And so it didn't have a continuous canopy. So when the fire came through here, it didn't have the chance to run in the crowns. And if it would have run in the crowns, it probably would have burned these houses down. And then the Kawanichi Visitor Center, which is right there too. So kind of a backwards way to think of it is that because the bark beetles, it did save. Because if the bark beetles didn't come and we had an intact lodgepole forest, with these conditions, it probably would have come through in a crown fire. And our houses were right in the middle of it. So that's just speculation. Oh, that's a t-shirt I had made when I first moved, when the bark beetles first came. This is something I didn't touch on, but the Fern Lake fire in 2012. So this is Forest Canyon coming up this way. On over Thanksgiving in 2012, the fire spotted on the other side of Forest Canyon and got established over here. And then I think it was December 1st of 2012, it made a run right through here. So you can kind of see there's a fire scar right in here, and that's Cub Lake. Mm-hmm. So East Troublesome burned up to, this is where it was the morning of the 22nd. And so that day that we were expecting it, like, okay, the fire's going to jump up and it's going to come on the 23rd, I think it was. It ran into this fire scar. So it had to not only come back from the fog, but it also had to chew through an area that didn't have as much fuel. So the Fern Lake fire also slowed the fire down. And then this one shows our fuels treatments. So during the planning of this, we had, the incident management teams were, because of COVID, we would usually, before COVID, we'd usually have 200 people in a tent and listen to a briefing. But because of COVID, they were doing these briefings online. So all the firefighters would be out in the woods, and you could see a live streamed, Facebook. And it was funny because the guys who were doing the briefings got a fan base. So all the Facebook comments were like, "Hey, we want to see such and such. He's really cool," or "He's cute," or whatever. But we had one of these operations guys. He kept calling it the catcher's mitt, and so it caught on. So people all over the place were like, "Oh yeah, we're going to use the Rocky Mountain catcher's mitt." And what they meant is all the yellow is the fuels treatments that we've done over time. And so he was like, "That's going to be our catcher's mitt, is the fuels treatments." So the red is the shape of the East Troublesome fire, and then how it played into planning and actually suppressing it. So up in Upper Beaver Meadows, the fuels treatments were directly used. I mean, they made, no question, those fuels treatments helped. And then down here in Moraine Park, we knew that it had burned during the Fern Lake fire. And even during the Fern Lake fire, the fuels treatments that we had done in Cayley Cottages prevented a whole bunch of other, there was one structure that burned, but it was the only one, even though it got slammed by fire. And that fuel treatment, we were able to stop the fire from jumping the Bear Lake Road. So we used the knowledge that we got from the Fern Lake fire in planning. Even though we didn't burn directly off of the fuels treatment, we used that knowledge from the fuels treatments to plan on what we would do. And then we talked about that. So that's just kind of the shape of the fire. It's kind of cool. And then this is just kind of a picture of, how the park sits in relation to Estes Park. And it shows the drainages that all point towards Estes Park. And then our fuels treatments. We do a little prescribed burning. We haven't done as much prescribed burning. So we do piles and pile burning. So we'll build these piles and then burn the piles. But then prescribed burning is where you select an area of land, you create a buffer around it or a place where you can stop the fire, and then strategically light that area. So you're burning the entire area as it sits. I made the comment about lodgepole areas are going to all burn at once, but here in Estes Valley, we're fortunate enough to have the kind of a Ponderosa community, and Ponderosa is meant to have fire run through it. And as you drive into the park, up in the Upper Beaver Meadows, if you look off to the right, that's where this prescribed burn was. And what happens with these big ponderosas is as they get older, and we know, so our fire history shows in the Estes Valley that there were fires every 15 to 30 to 35 years. So if you were here before people, and we're just standing here, over the course of time, a lightning strike would happen and fire would burn through the grass. And these ponderosa trees have thick bark, and so the fire just burned right across it. And these branches, as the ponderosa trees get older, the branches grow out, and then they start going towards the ground. And so these frequent fires, you can see how low the fire is there, singes those bottom branches and kills the bottom branches so that the next time a fire comes by, it doesn't burn the branches. If there's not fire, those branches are allowed to go all the way to the ground. And then when even just a small fire comes through, it catches the branches on fire and then it kills the whole tree. So these trees need frequent fire. So as you drive into the park, you can kind of see off to the right, that prescribed burn did an excellent job of fire pruning the trees. So you can see some of the bark is still a little black, but I think most of the needles have fallen off now. Like they died the first year, and then, because this was like 3 years ago. So yeah, it's a different story in Ponderosa areas.
Yeah. And I guess this is one of those things too, in land management, because I hear these comments sometimes from the community of, why are they doing this? Why are they doing that? But I guess the bottom line is we are already involved and have already impacted it. So this is the most responsible thing to do to replicate what naturally would be occurring without human interference.
Yeah. Yep. And before I moved here, doing prescribed burns was kind of one of the things that I actively sought. You call it, instead of an incident commander, you're called a burn boss. But I actively sought out being a burn boss on prescribed burns at LAS and a lot of different parks that I've worked at. And when I first moved here, it was even here it was a little easier because we're on the Front Range. We've got Estes Park, but the social acceptance of management lighting a fire, people are like, "What are you, crazy?" But in 2007, 2008, 2009, we had some pretty big burns in Horseshoe Park, up near the Junction. Yeah, Deer Junction. 600-acre prescribed burns. And I think it was 2010, we did just a small 20-acre burn near South Lattle Moraine. And we had to stop because we had a fire start at Great Sand Dunes. But then we had Fern Lake fire, we had the floods, and then just fire awareness around us, that just trying to implement a prescribed burn with all of our other responsibilities and then all the preparation it takes is become harder and harder and harder. It's like we haven't done a prescribed burn in 3 years. That was the last one. Although we know that it needs to happen. I said it earlier, Mother Nature wants this to burn, and it's going to burn. So if we can pick a day that is not as intense, that the smoke is going a different direction, and we can light it, then that's much better than when Mother Nature wants to burn it. But there's been a lot of, there's been escape prescribed fires in the news, which is big news. So anytime you put fire on the ground, you're accepting a big risk. We mitigate those. We have a very detailed prescribed burn plan that, again, shared risk. We bring a bunch of people in. We all look at the plan. You have to have a separate technical reviewer come out and review it. And then finally, the superintendent has to sign off on it. And then we bring in all kinds of resources, more than we need to do that. But it's a high risk activity. So yeah, it's much more difficult to do than it was, years ago. And you asked about partnerships. It's like, yeah, you can't do without it. So I have a slide dedicated to all of our partners. And then these are just some Cameron Peak slides. Yeah, so we had 7,485 acres of Cameron Peak burn the park, and then 21,307 of East Troublesome, those are big fires for our park. There we go.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your time.
You bet. Yeah. Probably one of the last ones I ever do.
Oh yeah, congratulations on your retirement.